You're listening to the Hello World Podcast, number 55. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. Here at the Hello World Podcast, we decided not to have a sponsor. But if you'd like to support the podcast and the kinds of things that I do, feel free to visit my Pluralsight courses at shawnw.me/psauthor. That's shawnw.me/psauthor. On today's show, we're going to have Rick Strahl. Rick is the big kahuna and janitor at West Wing Technologies, located on the beautiful island of Maui, Hawaii. Between windsurf sessions and spiky-haired adventures, Rick has been a software developer for over 25 years, developing business and web applications since the very early days of the web when you needed a hand crank or a pair of wire splicers to get online. Today, Rick builds client-centric web applications and services for customers with HTML5, JavaScript, and mobile web technologies, using AngularJS as the front end and ASP.NET Stack on the back end. Rick's company, West Wind Technologies, also produces a number of developer-related tools, including the West Wind Web Search, West Wind Web Monitor, and HTML Help Builder. He also maintains a host of open source libraries at github.com/Rick Strahl, and you can find Rick's blog at weblog.westwind.com or contacting him directly at rstrahl@westwind.com. I remember the first time I saw Rick at a conference. You could see he was not wearing the usual garb. He often can be seen with a surfer t-shirt, spiky hair, and a smile from ear to ear. He's always very passionate about the technology and loves to talk to anyone about it. I was really excited to get him on the show, and today we're going to get to talk about how he got started. It's a very interesting story, and I think you'll enjoy it. Let's take a listen. So on today's show, we have someone that I always thought had a really rough life because he spends time in Europe and Hawaii. It's a really difficult place to work, don't you think, Rick?
Yeah, it's very difficult.
And so you go from place to place, but you've been running your own company, developing web apps forever. Is that what at least that's my assumption.
Yeah, it's been quite a while. I mean, I started fairly early in the web, in terms of the web frameworks when things were starting up in the mid-90s for web development.
In the dark ages.
Well, sort of, yes. But I mean, I had to start much sooner than that, actually, in terms of, the software development that I got started with, which was actually in the mid-80s. I got introduced to computers way back then in high school, actually.
And did you have a computer at the house, or was this just that you took a course in high school?
Originally, I actually had a friend who had a computer, and I think this was something like 1982. His dad was he was doing some work at Apple, and he was getting computers for free, so he had a computer at the house. And that's my very first experience with a computer, actually, that I had.
And where was this?
This was actually in California at the time.
Oh, okay.
So I had just arrived from Germany. So I grew up in Germany originally. And then in 1982, I came to the States to live here. And the first place I landed was California at the time.
And did your parents send you there, or did they come with you?
No, I came with my mother. My parents are divorced, and so my mother decided she was sick of living in West Berlin, and so she wanted to get out to a place where there was a little more sun, That's
a good call, actually. I've been to Berlin.
Yeah. Well, it can be dreary, but these days it's a lot hotter there than it used to be, and the winters are a little bit more mild than what I remember anyway. I don't know if that's just childhood memories that have been perverted over the years, or whether it is actually changed.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you came over here, your friend had an Apple, and was this like an Apple II or one of those in that era?
I'm not exactly sure, but I think it was an Apple II. It was definitely an Apple II, but I don't remember it was a 2 or 2 Plus or 2E or something. I think it was a 2. It was one of the original ones.
Oh, okay.
So he wasn't really, that much interested in it. But when I came over, we kind of started tinkering around with it. I was immediately enamored by that thing. And so the dad had put on some games and things that he was playing around with, and some business software of some sort that I knew nothing about at the time, of course.
Of course.
So my introduction, as for most people, was with games, basically. And I think at the time, the thing that we started with was Zork, I think.
Wow, I love Zork.
So, we're running through dungeons and trying to type the text. And at the time, that was just... I don't know. There was something about using the computer as opposed to playing Dungeons and Dragons on a board, and it was kind of exciting.
Absolutely. And in 1982, how old were you?
I was 15.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, or going on 16.
That's about the right time to get that interest up. And then in high school, you said that you took a course?
Yeah, so I arrived from Germany in 82, and I think in 83, they introduced a computer lab at the high school that I was at, which was one of the first in the country, actually.
Wow.
And they had a bunch of apples in there. And, of course, I jumped at the opportunity to actually get in and learn something more official. It turns out that I knew more about the computers than the teacher. And so I actually teamed up with the teacher to, build some samples for the class to work on, I guess.
Oh, wow.
And so I learned programming essentially from scratch right there. I bought a couple of books and taught myself how to do the basics. And I took advantage of the computer lab as much as I could. Whenever I could, I would stay after school and spend extra time down there.
And was that GW Basic?
It was AppleScript, I think, at the time.
AppleScript, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, I mean, it was very, very primitive back then. They didn't, like I said, he didn't really have a curriculum. So he kind of did the same thing that I did, which is essentially look at books and try to figure out some samples for everybody to run. I have no idea what we built. I do seem to remember we built like some simple animations, moving stuff around the 40 by 20 screen, which was pretty silly at the time. But I don't know. There was something about that really was exciting to me, and it obviously left a memory that, has carried me through the rest of my life.
And did you know pretty soon that this is what you wanted to do work-wise, or?
Well, it was just a fun thing to do at the time.
Sure.
It wasn't really, I didn't really think that far ahead, and I had no idea how to apply I wasn't even thinking about that, I don't think. I was just thinking of my own enjoyment at the time. So, when you're 16 years old, you're not really too concerned about your career 20 years down the road, right?
No, not at all. Not at all.
So I was just kind of playing around and not really thinking about what I was going to do with my life at the time.
And did you eventually get a computer at the house, or?
Yeah. So I ended up actually graduating high school. And so the computer lab went on through, I guess I graduated in 84, I guess a year and a half or 2 years or so. And then I graduated and I ended up going to community college. But at the same time that I graduated high school, the dad of the friend of mine that that had introduced me to computers, he actually wanted to sell me one of his computers, and I jumped on the opportunity to do so.
Nice.
Yeah. So I ended up with an Apple II Plus, and I started, learning how to program properly.
Now, the Apple II Plus still didn't have lowercase letters. Is that correct?
No, I think it did. And it also had the ability to plug CPM cards into it and things like that. So that was really when things started to shift. So when I went to community college, which again, this was in the 80s, they still had a computer lab that had mainframe or had some sort of mini computer or something that you had to work on. So you had to schedule time to get into the lab and actually, put your code in and then wait for it to run, and the job would come back sometime later. And so I actually had a computer, which was pretty rare at the time. And so I could do all my work at home, which was very convenient.
Well, that is convenient. Wow. And I assume you were taking courses in computers there as well.
Right. Sort of. Again, it was very early. And at the community college, they didn't have a whole lot of classes. So you had to take the 101 class, which was a joke. Mm-hmm. Here's how you turn on the computer. And, they were trying to teach you the very, very, very basics of programming. And I don't even remember what it was. I think it was some variation of BASIC that you were working with. But it was, I just showed up to class and then didn't even pay attention, basically, because it was so basic. And it wasn't until the second year that they ended up getting a teacher in there that actually was a very, very excellent teacher. In fact, it's somebody that I remember back even now.
Wow.
And I consider that person to be the person who really turned me on to programming and where I am at today, essentially.
Interesting.
So it was an assembler class. And I remember thinking, who in their right mind would build code like this? But it was still one of the best classes that I ever took for anything, because it introduced us to the low levels of, how computers work, registers, how to add registers, how to move stuff around in memory and so forth. And as I said, the teacher was excellent in terms of explaining of how this related to how the computers work, and then also related it to higher level languages, which at this time was, well, you're using a high level language, it's C++ or C. In fact, it was C. I don't think C++ was just starting out, I think, around the time when I was there. And it was, again, really exciting to me because it was just interesting to be able to make the computer do something and see the results immediately displayed to you. And so this was around the time when the first PCs were arriving. So they actually switched their lab over to, I think it was IBM PCs of some sort. And so we're actually able to write programs and be able to run and see them run immediately. Nice. So I still had my Apple II, which was awesome because I could run and plug the CPM card in it and basically do the same things that they were doing on the IBM PCs at the time. Nice.
And so were they running CPM on the PCs, or was it just that they both had the same software?
They still had this. They just had the same software. I don't think they were running CPM. Cool. So CPM is sort of I don't really remember how all that worked exactly. It's so long ago. But all I remember is that you could run a lot of the same applications. And the key at the time was you had to be able to run, the assembler for the assembler class, but then the same compilers.
Right.
Yeah. So I think actually one of the other classes that I took was I don't know if it was an architecture, I think it was an algorithms class. And that class was actually done in Pascal. And at that time I was introduced to Turbo Pascal. And as a lot of people did in those days, I guess. Yeah. And so
that blew up.
That was another thing that was kind of interesting. So coming from assembler and AppleScript and then going to a more classical language that actually had a lot more horsepower.
Yeah. Yeah. And you could get things done much more quickly than an assembler, I bet.
Yeah. Well, so what was interesting is and I fondly remember this memory. So I was in this assembler class, and this teacher that was really awesome, he introduced me to macros, assembler macros. And, the first thing that I did is like, obviously this is the solution to all of my problems and why, assembler doesn't have to be this difficult to hack. I can write these wrappers around everything. And I went wild with building basically a component library.
Wow.
And I remember the guy, I handed in my assignment, and it was basically componentizing all these little things that instead of writing one huge blob of code. Right. And so I handed this in, and he goes, "Wow, really?" He's like, "You shouldn't be programming an assembler." So I guess
That's
even
funny.
back in those days, I had the knack for abstracting away complexity into something more high level.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And did this soon lead to your first job, or did you graduate first?
Well, I had a very short career in college, actually. I went to community college for 2 years. And the main reason that I went was for the computer classes. But in those first 2 years, I ran out of classes to take because it was only a very small curriculum.
Sure.
And then the 2 classes that I took, they were the most advanced classes that you could take, and they were excellent. And I decided it doesn't make sense to actually stay in college and do more with this. So at the same time that I was towards the end of high school, I actually was in a number of bands, punk rock bands at the time.
That's great.
So I was at the same time, staying up late every night, basically either practicing or being out playing gigs or going to shows. So I was really burning the flame on both ends, I guess. But being in the band was actually an inspiration to start building my first business application, which was tracking all of our merchandise. And so at the time, I think I had my Apple II CPM machine, and I was playing around with, I think DBase it was at the time. And I got into databases. And, I just put all our inventory in. And originally, I just used the database system as it is. I didn't really write a program. It just was cool to be able to put all the inventory in and look back, be able to update the inventory quantities. That was exciting in those days. It wasn't a program. You had to actually, use the database, search for the record, and then put stuff into it.
Yeah, you would run DBase and then
exactly
sit into that interactive environment. Yeah. I spent a lot of time in DBase, so I have a soft spot in my heart for it as well. And what kind of merch were you doing? Were you, I guess in the mid 80s, it would have still been tapes.
Yeah, so we were selling demo tapes and records. So we had I think at the time when we started out, we had a single out, and then later on we had more records that we were selling.
Oh, nice.
Mostly T-shirts, posters. What else did we have? Stickers, things like that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Most of the people I knew that had bands in the 80s didn't even think of merchandising. They were just trying to play. So you guys must have been had a pretty good following.
Yeah, we were an underground punk rock band, but we were fairly well known, I guess.
Oh, that's awesome.
We actually went to Europe and played a 6-week tour over there, and then we toured on the West Coast quite a bit.
Wow. I didn't know you were a rock star.
Well, I wouldn't call it a rock star, but it was definitely something that shaped my life because I was really into the music. Before I got into the band, actually, I was involved in the community, the music community that was, well, I don't know if you would call it a community. It was just people hanging out, I guess. But it was a very important part of my life. And getting into a band was something that was at the time just the most awesome thing in the whole wide world.
Sure.
And so, as is often the case for me, is I tend to combine the things that I love to do. And so the computer stuff combined with the band stuff was actually an interesting thing for me to do at the time.
Interesting. And did you say a punk band, and so I can't imagine that at the same time you would get into any of the electronic music that was sort of budding then with all the introduction of MIDI and all that.
Yeah, I didn't do any of that. No.
The antithesis of punk music
right.
is electronica. Yeah,
it's the antithesis exactly. Nothing funny. Electronic. Get it out of here.
Yeah. That's awesome. I have kind of the same experience. I played music through my whole life in bands and all this other stuff. But I never wanted my computers and music to cross, except, maybe to design a logo here or whatever. I never wanted to get into anything electronic at all, and I just see a lot of musicians that are programmers. That's kind of where they end up at, is sequencers and keyboards and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
So
well, at the
nice
time, there wasn't really a whole lot of tooling for that either. It was you couldn't. I mean, there were tools for that, but I really didn't have any interest in that. Those were two separate things, and one part of it, the business, the merchandising was the business part of it, and I just enjoyed doing that. And so that particular piece of it, the merchandising and the software application that I ended up building for it, actually was my first introduction to building something real and not just playing around, basically.
Yeah.
And so at the time I started with DBase, and then I quickly found something that, again, became very important in my life, which was Foxbase. Mm-hmm. And Foxbase was essentially a version of DBase that ran about 10 times faster.
Right.
It was just incredibly fast compared to DBase. So DBase was, it was XBase, basically what we know as XBase today, which is the DBase language, essentially, right? So it's a database description language, a DDL, essentially, that allows you to access records in the database, replace data into it. It was not SQL, but it was something that preceded SQL, essentially, to access databases and get stuff out. So DBase was essentially just the language. And then later on, I believe they added some UI features, some very basic UI features. And Foxbase did the same thing, but they extended the UI features quite a bit. And of course, the database engine was just wickedly fast compared to what DBase was doing.
Sure.
And so, there were newer versions of DBase and Foxbase that were coming out, and these things were getting more sophisticated so that you could actually build real applications with these things. And I ended up building what essentially amounted to a small point of sale application with some merchandising backend. So inventory management, essentially.
Cool.
And it's very basic at the time, but every time I showed it to somebody, they were just blown away. Oh my God, I didn't know you could do this. So the interesting thing is the person that sold me the computer, my friend's dad, he actually owned a consulting business or computer repair business / consulting business. And
sure.
I kind of stayed in touch with him, and every once in a while we would talk, because I tended to be the only person that he knew outside of work that was actually into computers in any way. So his son really wasn't into it. He was into the games, but that's where it stopped for him. But for me, it was just anytime I talked to him, we would talk about computers and, what's the newest thing? And what are you doing? So he started this consulting business, basically, or a repair business. And he said, well, why don't you come check out and see if you can, work with me? And so I decided to take him up on it. And that was exciting because at the time I was working a print shop. I was working in a physical print shop.
Oh, wow.
Doing printing. It has nothing to do with computers at all. Right?
No.
Totally unrelated. And again, the reason for that is at the time, there really wasn't a lot of opportunity for software development because there was nobody was really doing it. Most people didn't even know what a computer was, much less what they could do with it.
Absolutely.
So it was just starting out, and there was very little demand for it. And I wasn't in a place where I was in the community where I could have possibly benefited off of that a little bit better. So at the time, because I was busy with the band and having a job, I kind of just kept doing it on the side. But anyway, so I ran into the dad of my friend, and he offered me a job at this consulting business. And I thought, great, finally I get to do what I really want to do, and so on. So this business was he was running it basically to other businesses, essentially. So he was in like a office park somewhere. And what he was trying to do essentially is run a computer repair / consulting business. And he was pretty busy, but it turns out most of the work he was doing ended up being hardware repair.
Sure.
People would bring in their printers and go, can you fix this? And so me, of course, thinking, I'm going to be great at this, software development stuff. I'm going to do all this coding and it'll be great. turns out there wasn't much demand for that.
Right.
So instead of doing all of this, I ended up doing computer repair, swapping out cards and computers, and trying, not very successfully, to repair printers. I don't know if you've ever had to repair a printer. It's really tedious work. I mean, mechanical work.
Yeah,
you have to have an aptitude for it.
Yes, absolutely.
And there was a gentleman at this, an older person who had done this all of his life, and he was trying to teach me how to do this, and it just wasn't working. I had absolutely no aptitude for fixing, printers and, taking out 100 pieces and then putting them back in the same order. And so that lasted for only about 2 months or so before I decided, I can't do this. This is not this is not something that I can do. So in the whole time that I was there, I think it was 2.5 months, I think I did 2 or 3 software related things at all. And most of these were like, fixing fixing whatever kind of spreadsheets. I don't think it was Excel at the time.
Probably Lotus at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. It was Lotus or VisiCalc maybe.
VisiCalc. Yeah. Probably VisiCalc in that time.
Yeah. So I was thwarted by my first computer job. I tend to think of it as a total failure, but that was probably because I was totally misqualified for that particular job.
I bet.
Yeah. So anyway, the guy that hired me, so he was, very apologetic about it because he said, yeah, I know it's not really what you wanted to do, but I thought we'd give it a try. So that didn't work out, obviously. And it was quite a while, actually, before I actually ended up with a real computer job. Well, it was never really a job. I ended up doing consulting on my own, actually, but it was quite a while later that I actually got into that properly.
Nice. And so through most of this time, up until you started working, you really didn't have a mentor or someone that could sort of lead you the way. You were searching and learning pretty much on your own through all of this.
Yeah, I'm pretty much self-taught completely. And, in the 80s, there was no internet. So The only way that you could learn was really, there's only 2 avenues that I remember, is mainly books. You'd go to a bookstore and, teach yourself C++ or Pascal or whatever the hot thing was. At the time then, when there was FoxPro, and that language was easy enough. You could kind of figure it out on your own. You didn't need books or anything. And very quickly, it actually turns out that I turned into an expert on that. And I ended up actually doing presentation at user groups. And then eventually that morphed into something more a little bit later. I'll come back to that a little later.
Sure.
In the meantime, though, I was still I got my job back at the print job, because apparently I did good enough of a job that they wanted me back there. So I was thinking, well, maybe manual labor is going to be for me after all. I got my job back there, and I actually looked at their operation at some point, and I said, well, you guys could really benefit from automating your operation quite a bit by using computers. And so this particular print shop, they were doing real estate newsletters. So they were basically a mailing list manager and a shipping company that would do, the typical real estate newsletter. So they would basically typeset the copy and then send out the newsletters on behalf of the actual realtors. So I at some point went in and talked to the boss there, and I showed him what I'd been doing with my Apple, and he was like, oh my God, that's awesome. We could definitely use that. So he had a computer in his office actually, and was using it with spreadsheets, but again, he was struggling. And so every once in a while he'd call me over and go, can you help me out here? And so more and more I was getting involved in computer support essentially, and then eventually also building their essentially their print management system and mailing manager system.
Nice.
And all of this is essentially still in DOS, right?
Right.
We're still running on, I think, maybe 80 by 20 screens at this point.
If that, yeah.
Which, can you imagine that today?
No, I cannot.
I mean, how the heck did we do anything? I mean, how do you fit anything into 80 characters on the screen? It's incredible.
No, all this and data entry screens and having all this tiny space, right. in even on an iPhone, you have more space than we had to lay things out. And
not
at least
only
you could scroll on the iPhone.
You couldn't even scroll, right? You had to have a button at the bottom. And so you needed to actually program those screens. If you had more data than would fit on a single screen, you had to press a button to go to the next screen and start entering more data. And all of that wasn't automated in any way. No. It's absolutely crazy if I think about it today. And so at this company, essentially, I helped them computerize eventually. So they were doing everything manually. And by the time I actually left the company, they were doing everything by computer. So their typesetting system, eventually they went to desktop publishing.
Nice.
And we did it on a PC, not on a Mac at the time. And I introduced their person to, I don't know what it was. What was the leading DOS thing? Windows thing. So as Windows started coming out, and I think it was the very first version of Windows.
Probably PageMaker was the, I remember being the big one on DOS. Or Quark.
Yeah, I think, well, that's all Mac, isn't it? I don't remember. There was one on Windows that was very popular at first, but I don't remember the name of it.
Me either.
Yeah. Anyway, so, we basically computerized that entire business, including the core part that I had to maintain, though, was that shipping business, essentially, of managing the news, the realtors that they were dealing with, and then also the shipping and, progress of where we were in the print queue and whatnot.
Nice. And so you were essentially being paid as a manual labor, but getting to write software for them.
Exactly. Well, so what happened is I got split pay.
That's nice.
And I negotiated that whenever I would do computer work, I'd keep that time separate, and then I was paid not a whole lot more, but a little bit more at least.
Whatever you could talk them into. Yeah.
So it was about 50% more. So
nice. That's not bad.
That was not too bad. Yeah.
No.
I mean, I was pretty happy because it gave me the opportunity to actually do computer work that I could put on my resume, right? It was official. It wasn't just something, I was working in my bedroom doing something. So This was real work.
And did that lead more to the consulting business, or did you find another job after that?
It's I continued that job until I actually left California in the I think like early 90s, and so I was doing that on the side, and then at the same time I also worked with a windsurf shop in California in San Francisco actually, and I sold them on the idea of building a point of sale system.
Nice.
And so I took what I had built previously with, my merchandising business, and then also what I have done for the print shop, and merged that into sort of a generic version of a point of sale system.
Nice.
And so that company, that windsurf shop, was actually the first company that I tried it out on, and then kind of refined it and decided, this is pretty nice. And there wasn't a whole lot of solutions out for point of sale. And I decided to actually sell it online at that point.
Nice.
So I put a few ads into, some of the magazines that I was reading, which were mostly database related stuff.
Sure.
And I actually found that it was reasonably popular. So I sold, I don't know, maybe 500 copies or something of it.
Nice.
It definitely didn't make me rich, but it was kind of exciting to see something selling as a pre-made, software solution.
Yeah. And you did this the whole time you were in California?
Yeah, I did this all in California, and pretty much all on the side. So I had my print job. I was doing the band at the time. And then whatever time I had in between, I was throwing into basically the computer related stuff to build out this point of sale system, do some of the consulting work. It was a very busy time.
Sound very busy. You go straight from band practice to software development to sleep to back to the print job.
Well, it was pretty much the band practice was the last thing. Because it was, we'd be practicing from, I don't know, like 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night until midnight or something, then drive back from wherever band practice was. By the time I'd get to bed, it'd be 2 in the morning, then get up at 8 to go to work, then have a few hours in the afternoon to do whatever computer work needed to do. And then, back to band practice a couple, 2-3 times a week.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. And so where did this go from here?
Okay, so I was doing, at the time, all of this development was basically done in Foxbase, and then slowly it migrated into Fox Pro,
right?
Which was basically the Windows version of whatever Fox software had become. So Windows came out in the meantime. I don't know, it's like late 80s or early 90s?
Early 90s, yeah.
Yeah, I think very early 90s. And so Fox morphed into Fox Pro at some point. Actually, there was a Fox base version, I believe, that was the first Windows versions were just based on Fox base still, but they had a Windows interface that came out. So I was able to, with several of my clients, I was able to convert those applications with very little effort, actually, into Windows applications.
Nice.
And again, that was an opportunity to learn something new and get paid at the same time. And it gave me great opportunity to actually refine my point of sale application at the time. And I kept selling that on the side. And again, it wasn't a big money maker, but it seemed like a good idea at the time.
And it scales better than a per hourly, certainly.
Yeah. So at the same time, I was getting into Fox Pro pretty heavily, Fox Base and Fox Pro pretty heavily. And I started speaking at, local user groups and getting involved in the Fox Pro community. I'd answer questions on Compuserve at the time.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question I'd like to ask since you mentioned Compuserve. Do you remember your number?
I know it started with a 9.
I don't remember mine anymore either. Just every once in a while,
it's funny that you asked that, because I have a sort of a vision in my mind. I can see some of the numbers that actually make sense to me, but I can't see the whole number.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to tell you if I knew. Because who knows, Compuserve may still be lurking somewhere.
I'm sure it probably is. There are probably some diehards, and on the, what did they call them? The special interest groups, the SIGs. Yeah.
Yeah. So Compuserve was actually it's an interesting thing that I remembered that, because I actually made a few notes here, and Compuserve wasn't on there, but Compuserve was actually a very, very large part for me of learning and getting involved in the community. And I think that was something very important to me, because once I was able to get online and be able to do this, I learned so much more from other people and asking questions and getting involved, and even in becoming sort of an expert in my field, which happened to be Fox Pro at the time, or Fox Base, Fox Pro, and meeting other people that were like-minded, right? So
right, because you went from, I might have a couple of friends in the city I live in that know about this, to suddenly having 100 or 200 or even in some cases thousands of people to bounce these ideas off of it. For me, that was the first community that I really could get involved in, was CompuServe. And it was a huge shift in the way that I did software.
Absolutely, for me too. And again, what happened is my knowledge just soared after that. I was able to just get so much more information in all these little tricks and tips. Or, you'd look at people's problems and you go, oh, I know how to solve that. And then somebody else would jump in and go, well, there's an easier way to solve that than what you were doing.
Yeah.
And it's just the conversation alone was worth gold right there.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that was a tremendous shift for me. I mean, previously I had been using BBSs, private PBSs that you had to dial into. Mm-hmm. And I also ran my own for like a few months or maybe a year. And, certain times of the night I would open up the phone, and I was always surprised when somebody would actually log on and download something. So at the time, I think I was running BBS software, and that was one other thing. I was modifying the BBS software and then making the mods available online, so people would actually come and download them.
Oh, nice.
So. But anyway, so Compuserve really resulted in a humongous shift for me. And it was twofold for me because, number one, I was able to learn much more. I was able to connect with other people, but also I found that I really had a knack for helping people out. I really was able to dig in, and I really enjoyed looking at people's problems and then also solving their problems. And that in many ways ended up leading to some short-term consulting opportunities. So I would help somebody out with something on the forum, and then there'd be another thing, and sometimes they needed more help, and so we would hook up, and I would do some work for them, either on a consulting basis or just a simple phone call, and you pay me with a credit card, basically.
Sure. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And so as I started doing that, I started realizing this is probably something that I could do full time if I dedicate my resources to it more.
Yeah.
And so in the very, very early 90s, I think in 1991, I actually decided that the band business was turning too serious. So we'd gone through a number of different bands, and in the process, we were basically the same people from the very beginning when I started in the band. And then towards the end of that cycle, we started going too commercial for my taste. It was all trying to, how do we make it instead of really having fun? And we weren't making any money. We were breaking even. We're not putting money into it, which apparently is rare. Yeah. Usually when you have a band, it costs you a bunch of money to do the things that you do, to go on tour, to, pay for the practice room, to play, to, buy strings for your bass or guitar or whatever. So we made a little bit of money, but not a lot. It was definitely not a career. So towards the end of that, everybody in the band was thinking, well, we should be making some money, so let's try and tailor our music to try and make some money. Obviously, coming from our punk rock roots, that wasn't really the ultimate.
Yeah, that's the opposite of what the whole movement,
So, at the time we tended to go into a more of a rock direction, and we did actually get a record contract with a somewhat largish company, Combat Records at the time.
Oh, nice.
And we did land a pretty good record deal. But again, it was a record deal at the time. If you were a small time band, you were lucky if you were breaking even. Yeah. So there wasn't any money in it. And then at this point, it was where a lot of the people in the band were actually trying to aim for more commercial, to try and make it and keep this going and maybe eventually make some money of it. And it became too much of a business and decided that's not worth my time. We're never going to make enough money to make enough money so that you could just be in the band. And I just got tired of trying to tailor the music to something that I wasn't really that into. So
absolutely.
I jumped ship at that point and decided to just focus on other things. And those other things tended to be, software development, and then also another hobby that I picked up in the meantime, which was windsurfing. And so I would work as much as I could doing my consulting business, which was going rather slow at first.
Sure, as they always do.
Exactly. So I had a lot of free time on my hand, and I spent a lot of that free time jumping on a windsurf board and ripping around the river.
And where were you at this time? Because you said you had left California.
Yeah, so I'm still in California at this point. So this is in around 1990. And I was working out of my apartment, basically.
Sure.
And at some point, I decided I wanted to go somewhere where the windsurfing is better. So I decided to move to Hood River, Oregon, which is in the Columbia River Gorge.
Yep.
And this is where I'm at right now, actually. I spend my summers here a lot of times.
Oh, nice. And the windsurfing there is really amazing because of there's sort of that pipe action down the river, right?
Exactly. It's so, I remember when I first came here, I was kind of scared of the place, because people, you'd watch videos, and they have people sailing in 50-mile-an-hour winds and whatnot. And when I first arrived here on vacation I drove up every once in a while, I was, totally intimidated by this place. And then once I got here, of course, I realized, well, it's not always like that, number one. And even when it is crazy like that, you just have to have the right gear to do it. And
sure.
So I would drive up on vacation with friends, and we would hang out here for a couple of weeks maybe. And I just fell in love with the place. It's just an awesome, awesome place.
It is. I lived in Oregon for a few years and very regretted having to leave. So I'm a little jealous of where you are right now.
Yeah. And especially the windsurfing, it was really like the videos that I watched. It was sometimes really absolutely epic.
That's awesome.
It's this place. In fact, I just was windsurfing a couple of days ago. Actually on Friday, out east. So we drive out to a place called Arlington, and it was blowing. Literally, the gusts were over 50 miles an hour.
That's crazy.
And when the river is like that, it's a river, right? And the swell on the river, because the current goes against the wind, it will kick up swell that is easily 10 feet at times.
Wow.
And it's just an amazing, amazing experience. It's it's incredible when it is like that. And it is very, very, very addictive. So once you sail in conditions like that, and it really took me literally to the point where I experienced that when I came up for the first time. There was one day like that, and I was absolutely in love with it that I decided I have to move there. I have to move there.
Chasing the wind.
Yes. And that's actually been a story of my life, because that continues on later in life as well. So I packed up my stuff and just left my print job finally, quit that job, and decided, okay, I have enough references to give this consulting business a try at full time, pack up my stuff and go to Oregon.
That's awesome. So looking back on, the different decisions you've made, would you change anything, or anything you would have done sooner, done later, given up?
Well, the thing is, my life kind of unfolded on me totally haphazard. I did not plan any of the way my life has turned out. Mm-hmm. It just kind of happened. And I've just kind of followed my desires pretty much so far in life anyway. And so I just fell into the computer thing by being lucky to have run into my friend's dad, who happened to work at Apple and have an Apple computer at home, which was rare back then.
Absolutely.
And, then the consulting business kind of was an accident, right? I mean, I just played around with stuff and decided, well, maybe I'll give this a try. And then running into Compuserve and finding out that this is something that could be made into a business in a way, or could lead to business anyway, not the Compuserve itself, but being able to pick up business from that. It just kind of all followed a path that was totally unplanned. I didn't go to college really, other than those 2 years that I went to community college. And really, the only reason I went is to take those classes. Sure. I took a couple of other classes, but for the most part, I didn't really even follow a prescribed curriculum in those 2 years that I was in college. I only did it because I wanted those computer classes.
And it seems, my impression of it is that you've always followed your passion, not worried about where you were going, but just in that moment, whatever you were passionate about and all the things you were passionate about, were the things that drove you. And I think that's a good story for a lot of people that are trying to overplan their life.
Yeah, I think that's, to me at least, I mean, this may not be for everybody. I mean, you have to be able to take some risks, right? Sure. Because when I jumped to most people, when they jump to a consulting business, obviously they're taking a chance. But I believe that if you do what you enjoy, you're going to do a good job at it. And if you do a good job at it, there's a much better chance of succeeding at it than if you're doing something because you have to. Absolutely. And so as long as you're doing the things that you enjoy doing, I think chances are pretty good that you're going to succeed at it.
I think you're absolutely right on that. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for doing the podcast. This has been a really interesting story. I love the idea of the punk rock windsurfing developers now, the way I view you. I had no idea you did the punk rock music earlier. Of course, every picture of you online is you on windsurfing, so I don't think anyone hasn't seen that.
Yeah, well, the punk rock days are long, long gone, yeah.
I really want to see next time we're in person, you have to have some pictures of the punk rock hair. I don't know whether it's much different from your normal punk rock hair.
I used to have long hair, actually. We were kind of a crossover band, so we're one of the first bands that was mixing punk rock and metal. So,
oh, nice.
So we all came from a metal background, went into punk rock, and then kind of went back in between somewhere.
So you had the really long, straight...
Yep.
Those are pictures you're gonna have to share at some point.
I'll put some links in the show notes here.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, thanks for being on the show.
Okay, thanks. It was a fun discussion.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Sean.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the Hello World podcast.